Cloud engineering salaries sit near the top of the market. $150,000, $170,000, sometimes $180,000, and occasionally higher, which creates a clear perception. That cloud engineering is a direct path to high income. And in many ways it is, but only up to a point, because cloud engineering does not scale the way most people think. And that difference changes everything. Cloud roles sit close to infrastructure. They manage environments. They configure systems. They ensure availability. They keep systems running under pressure. And that proximity increases their importance. Because infrastructure is not optional. Everything depends on it. Applications, services, data, internal systems. If infrastructure fails, everything fails. And that creates a very specific kind of visibility, not just technical visibility, but organizational visibility, because the impact is immediate and measurable, which is why cloud salaries rise quickly. Early in the role, value increases fast, because companies need stability. They need people who can manage complexity. They need people who can prevent failure. But that is only the first phase, because once systems stabilize, the dynamic changes. Infrastructure becomes predictable, environments become standardized, processes become repeatable, and repetition changes value. Because when something becomes repeatable, it becomes scalable. And when it becomes scalable, it becomes distributable, which reduces the need for expansion. You don't need unlimited cloud engineers. You need enough to maintain the system, enough to support growth, but not more than that. And once that threshold is reached, growth slows, not because the role loses value, but because the system no longer needs to scale that role. This creates a structural ceiling around $170,000, $180,000, where compensation stabilizes, not suddenly, but gradually. You continue improving. You gain more responsibility. You manage larger environments. You work on more complex systems. But the structure around you does not change. And without structural change, compensation slows. This is where most engineers misread the situation. They assume more certifications, more tools, more experience will break the ceiling. But the ceiling is not skill-based. It is structural. Cloud roles manage systems. But they don't always control them. And that distinction is critical. Because managing a system and defining a system are not the same thing. Control sits at a higher level. Architecture, platform design, system ownership. And that is where compensation continues to expand. Not because those roles are more technical, but because they are harder to distribute. You can assign multiple engineers to manage infrastructure. You can split environments. You can divide responsibilities. But you cannot assign 10 people to define a system. At some point, control consolidates. And where control consolidates, value concentrates. That is why the ceiling exists, and why it holds, even for strong engineers, even for experienced ones, and even in high-paying companies, because the structure is consistent across environments, across industries, across teams. You are not just growing within a role, you are operating inside a system, and that system defines how far the role can go. There is also a second layer most people don't see. Cloud environments reduce complexity over time. They abstract infrastructure, they standardize deployment, they reduce the need for deep intervention, which means the system itself becomes easier to manage. And when a system becomes easier to manage, it requires fewer high-leverage roles. That reduction is gradual, but it is constant. And it reinforces the ceiling, because fewer roles carry higher value, and most roles stabilize below that level. This also explains why moving companies often creates temporary increases. You enter a new system, a different structure, a different valuation, a different level of complexity, and that creates a jump. But over time, the same forces apply. Standardization, stabilization, distribution, and the same ceiling appears again, because the underlying role has not changed. Only the environment has. So when you see cloud engineering salaries near $180,000, you are not looking at a limit of skill. You are looking at a limit of structure, a point where scalability, distribution, and system design converge. And unless your position changes, that point tends to hold. You can keep improving. You can keep learning. You can keep expanding your scope. But the system determines how far that translates into compensation, which is why most engineers approach that level and stabilize around it. Not because they can't go further, but because the system doesn't assign that level broadly. This is part of what I break down step by step in the $200,000 system below.